Well, thank you for skipping the Facebook session and showing up here. Much appreciated. I was thinking it's going to be me and a couple of my friends in the audience. So I don't have a lot of answers at all, actually. I have a bunch of questions, and you might find them to be relatively more about what is happening in the US and Western media. But I think it's important to think about those in relation to how they apply or don't apply to India. And you are all the experts on that. I am not. I used to run our newspaper here a long time ago. I keep up with India, but don't look for me to kind of really relate the conversation to India. I'm hoping that in the conversation that we can have, I don't have a lot of slides. I think it's 8 or 9 slides. And I'm hoping this will be more of a conversation. We can then talk about what does this mean or doesn't mean for India. So I've framed this more as like, here are 7 or 8 things that keep me up at night when I think about where our industry is going. Oftentimes, the media business is such that we tend to wait for something to happen and then really start panicking about it. We waited for search engines to come, and then they took over the business, and then we were like, oh my God, what's Google doing to us? Then we waited for Facebook to come and have 2 billion people before we all started panicking about how do we deal with Facebook. We kind of waited for mobile phones to take over our lives and then started panicking about, what does that mean for our business? So what I'm trying to do here is to kind of maybe get ahead a little bit and ask some of the questions we should be asking today about where things might be going and what should we be thinking about doing. And again, just bear with me, this is going to be a little bit more skewed towards where I live, which is in the US, but I think has significant applications to what's happening in India as well. So I'll begin by saying something that actually I think most of you know very well in India, because I hear a lot. Rupa was here in the first session saying print is really growing and how different that is from the West. I want to challenge that thinking, maybe in a Q&A, that print is actually growing in India. I think it is at a macro level, but it is actually not. But let's have that conversation. You've heard a lot about in the US that print is dying, right? I mean, actually, we are the only industry where CEOs of media companies go up on stage and say, I think my print product is going to disappear in 10 years or 20 years, right? No other industry talks about their own industry dying as much as print CEOs seem to want to do it. The reality, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately very carefully, is that print is really not going away even in the US. So I'll give you some numbers. In 2000, there were 1,480 newspapers in the US, right? This was 18 years ago. And today, in 2018, there are 1,286 newspapers. So about 100 newspapers have disappeared in literally 18 years, and a lot of them went like literally 5-7 years ago. There hasn't really been a US newspaper that has closed in the last 5 or 7 years. And a lot of these closures, these 130 papers that have disappeared, have often happened in a city which had multiple papers, meaning that there were 4 and now there are 3, there were 2 and there's 1. So despite all the talk of print dying, it is not going away. And here is the problem with that. Most media companies, especially those who have print and thinking of going digital, find themselves in this very awkward situation of a declining product. It's declining, no doubt about it, but something that still contributes 40-50% of your revenue and requires a significant amount of time and energy to be devoted to it every day. Right? So our ability as an industry to move as quickly as we ought to into digital and into mobile is significantly held back by the fact that we have this platform that is important and declining. So as a result, most mainstream media companies are not very good at making this transition, unlike some of the startups that don't have print. So I often get asked, how come, when I was at the Washington Post, at the Wall Street Journal, how come you don't move fast enough? How can you not be like BuzzFeed or Vice or Vox? The advantage they have is they really don't have to worry about print, while I do have to spend a lot of my time thinking about it. I have to think about the journalists who spend a lot of time putting the print product together. So this has become a bit of a challenge and a constraint, and how do we manage for this? Because some papers in the US tried to do some interesting experiments. They went from 7-day newspapers to 4-day newspapers. It was the worst possible thing you can do, right? Because all you're doing is reminding your audience that something that you thought was important every day is no longer important every day, right? So it actually caused more pain, and rather than kind of really solve for it. So in India, you hear the opposite, right? Which is that, of course, print is not going away. In fact, if anything, it's growing. So I'd like you to think about this in the context of what is happening to your pipeline. I don't know of anybody who's in their 20s who reads a newspaper, whether in the West or actually here, right? I think we'll be lying to ourselves if we think a lot of young people are reading newspapers. So your pipeline of readers is as empty as my pipeline of print readers, right? So you can convince yourself that print is growing, but the reality is you're looking at pretty empty pipelines. India is a young country, so it's possible that you'll have another 10, 15 years more of the existing readership base, but there are no new readers coming into print. So it puzzles me that a lot of media execs here don't want to do anything about it today, because I think a lot of them think that I'll retire by this time this happens and it'll be somebody else's problem. But the reality is it's a problem for most media companies as well. And the way we have dealt with it in the West is to figure out ways that we can leverage print for digital. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the things we did at News Corp was we discovered that a lot of people read a lot about homes and real estate and design and all of that when we publish those articles. In fact, the Wall Street Journal has a very popular section called Mansions, which is about really nice homes, and people love that section. And then we put that on the web, and we saw that that was getting a lot of traction. In media circles, it's called real estate porn, because you like to look at like people's homes and kind of vicariously enjoy that content. What we then decided was that if that is happening, is there a way digitally for us to turn that into a business? So we acquired a bunch of digital real estate companies all over the world, starting with Real Estate Australia, which is the largest real estate company. It's something like Housing or PropTiger or one of these big companies here. And then we invested in Realtor.com. We bought a bunch of companies because we had the content and we realized that people were consuming it in print. And when we put it on the web, it was doing very well. And then we said, how can we turn that same content into a business? What if we become the digital real estate kind of transaction company? So today, most people don't know this, but News Corp is the world's largest digital real estate company. 25% of their sales and a big chunk of their profits come from digital real estate. These are listings, right? So rather than sit here and kind of say advertising in print for real estate has declined, as we tend to do here, where the real estate sections went from being fat 20-page sections to nothing, I think the way to think about it is what am I doing in print that I can leverage kind of on digital, because print is really, again, not particularly going away. So I think that's the frame we need to have about where we're going with our print businesses. You can't wish it away. It's here. A large number of your people are going to consume to do that. And so that's, I think, another way to think about it. The second one, and this is, again, for those of us in the business, this is a little bit obvious. The reality is 70–80% of all digital advertising goes to Google and Facebook, and it'll go to Amazon, which is becoming a big factor, right? And as a result, there has been a tendency in our industry to say, advertising is not working for us, what else can we do, right? So I think there's a tendency to kind of think of it as a zero-sum game, saying that it's not working for us. In India, it's an issue because there is the Times of India group, which takes up most of the advertising, and then everybody else in a group too, fighting for even smaller pie. But the way to think about it is not necessarily saying, let me walk away from advertising. If you look at global trends in what's happening with ad spending, so these are Zenith numbers, they come out every year. The 2017 numbers show that 38% of global ad spending is in digital, 34% is in television, and then it starts falling down. 9% is in print, and then there's like magazines and outdoor and radio and all of that, right? So here is a relatively safe bet you can make about digital advertising. That 34% global ad spending on television is dramatically going to decline and move into digital video. TV, as we think of it, is going to have the same issues that we've had in print. They're facing a cliff and they're going to fall off because, again, most young people don't watch television the way we watch television, saying, let me go to a show at 9 o'clock and watch it. Right? So if you agree with that premise, a couple of $100 billion of advertising money is going to move from TV to digital, and digital is probably going to go to 60-70% of all ad spending. So let's agree that Facebook and Google will take 90% of that, right? Or maybe 95% of that. But the 5 or 10% of this growing pie is a pretty large amount of money. So as publishers, I don't think we should be thinking about walking away from it by saying advertising is not working for me. So I think it's important to think in terms of, even if I have a small piece of the pie, that pie is becoming very, very large in the next 10, 15 years. So as you think about business models, it's important to think about it. And this is relevant to a lot of companies are saying, what if I give an ad-free subscription model, right? So you're teaching your customers to think of advertising as bad, right? Basically saying, I'll give you an experience that has no ads and pay me, $10 a month or whatever. So it's important to think about, as you think about alternative sources of revenue, do I want to tell my readers that advertising is not the right thing for you? And do I want to walk away from this big source of revenue and try to get like little amounts of money from subscribers? So what do we do about it? Whether we have, I think most Indian companies are doing pretty well with programmatic advertising, which is like machines buying ads. But can we improve our data abilities? The Indian Express Group, for example, probably has about 100 million uniques a month, right, collectively across. That's a big number in terms of, but if they know their audience and if they can have better data, can they sell that same advertising in a better way? So again, I think the framing of it's either advertising or subscriptions is kind of generally a bad framing, and it's important to think that this business is going to grow rather than be very defeatist about it. Paywalls. It's a big thing in the US. About 17, 18 years ago, the Wall Street Journal was the first one, simply because they didn't give anything away. And then the Financial Times started it about 10 years ago, roughly, and then the New York Times followed. Today, about 70% of US newspapers have some kind of a paywall or subscription. Obviously, in India, you often hear that Indians will never pay, so let's not even kind of bother. We can get into that conversation separately. The reality of paywalls, though, has been quite disappointing after all these years. The most successful paywalls still have only about 5, 7, 8% of your monthly visitors willing to pay. The New York Times is a great example. It's considered one of the most successful recent paywalls. A couple of million people pay for it, but they get 100 million people on every month to their website. So there seems to be some kind of a barrier to the number of people wanting to pay from the number of people wanting to read. And that number seems to be in high single digits at best. That's been the history so far. So if you're counting on the paywall to kind of fix your revenue problem, it is not going to work. If you're going to think of paywall as an extra source of revenue, I think that's a viable option, but it's not going to solve for your walking away from advertising model. In India, again, there's an opposite problem where I think psychologically most Indian publishing companies don't even want to try innovation around subscriptions and memberships because they're too scared, I think, to try it because there's this pervasive belief that Indians won't pay. But if you look at some of the startups that are out there, like the Ken and a few others, both in India and in the West, you are finding niche audiences willing to pay for content. So one of the ways to think about it is there a way I can create like a membership model, not necessarily a subscription model, where I surround the subscription with a lot of other offerings? I'll give you an example again from the Wall Street Journal. So we used to charge about $250 for the subscription. And every year we would go back and tell you, thank you for being a subscriber, please renew, and your subscription is now going up to another $10. Right? So we were finding that 20-30% of the people were turning us down. They didn't want to do it. So we created what's called WSJ Plus, which is a membership model where we said, here are all the other benefits you get from being this really smart person who's a member of the Wall Street Journal community. And we gave, for example, we had a publishing business on the side called HarperCollins, which is a pretty large publishing company. So we would offer like 4 hardbound books as part of your annual membership. We had Fox on one side, so we would offer the ability to go participate in the tapings of shows. One of the easiest things that we did, which actually created a lot of value, was you'd be surprised at the number of people who want to come visit newsrooms. They think this is a magical place that amazing things happen. The reality is the newsroom sits there. It's the most boring place. It's there 24/7, a bunch of people working at their computers. But outside, people think that the coming together of a news product is pretty cool. And I think it is. So what we did was we created like a monthly visits to the newsroom. We would say 50 of the Wall Street Journal members can apply to come visit the newsroom in the evening. We would give them a glass of wine. Some editor would talk to them for 15 minutes. We would show them how things work. But we created scarcity out of nothing, right? Because the thing sits there all the time. But given that a lot of people want to do it, and we said, look, money can't buy this. You can't buy this thing. You have to be a member of the Wall Street Journal community, and part of your membership is this amazing perk on how things work in a newsroom. Similarly, we created access to events. We said 50 of you can attend this event for free, enter into a drawing, and the only way you can do it is if you're a member of the journal community. So what this meant was at the end of the year, when your subscription was running out, now I would come to you and say, thank you for being a member. We added up all the benefits we give you, and it's worth $1,000, right? And we're asking you to pay only $200. By the way, it includes the Wall Street Journal as part of it, right? Our churn rates, which is the number of people who would say no to us, went from like high 20% to like single digits. Because people felt special, people felt like I have an affinity. You can also do that on an emotional basis, right? In the US, again, the National Public Radio does this a lot. It runs campaigns that says, we are such an amazing part of your life. You would miss us if you are not here. Please donate money, right? So you can appeal both emotionally. And again, if you look at, I'll make this up as an example. If you look at perhaps a newspaper like the Indian Express, where people think of it as journalism of courage, or they're different, they're independent, and they stand for certain thing, you could appeal to that sense, in addition to saying we have all these amazing benefits that come from being a member of the Indian Express group. So I think thinking about subscriptions in India shouldn't be about Indians won't pay for content. You're probably right. Probably they won't. But thinking about it as saying, I will surround the content piece with a lot of other benefits and create some membership, create some exclusivity, and maybe they'll pay for that. And I think trying those things might be a good idea rather than waiting for your advertising business to collapse and then figuring out how to charge for people, right? So again, thinking more creatively about subscriptions in terms of membership might be an interesting way to think about how do you get people to give you money for content without telling them it's actually money only for the content as well. This is a bit more of a kind of a philosophical point I want to make. I see that there are in the audience several people who actually are editors and who manage newsrooms as well. Our reality has been that our business models were based on people coming to us, right? Meaning people buying Hindustan Times or Times of India because that's the paper they get in their doorstep, or coming to our website, coming to indiatoday.in and spending time there. And our hope was they would come, they would spend time, we would have advertising there, we would other things, and we'll make money. And we were pretty bad at it, right? Because most of us have a lot of people coming to our sites, but we are not really able to monetize that in a big way. And then in between, some interesting things happened. Google and Facebook and all these guys came along. And I'll give you some numbers to understand what this means. And these are US numbers. So in 2000, there were 12,000 active blogs in the US. In 2015, and this number probably has gone up quite a bit, So 2000, there are 12,000 blogs. In 2015, there are 150 million blogs in the US. And by US, I mean they're based out of US, meaning anybody can read it, obviously. It's online. Email. In 2000, the US sent 12 billion emails. In 2015, that number became 247 billion emails. Right? Text messages. The US was slightly behind. There were 450,000 text messages being sent in the US in 2000. In 2015, it was 4.5 billion text messages. The point I'm trying to make is like our audiences have significantly moved away from coming to us and reading us or spending time with us and doing things much more on their own, right? Facebook now has, every month it goes up, but I think the last time they put out some numbers, they have 2 billion active users, right? These are active, not just passive. These are 2 billion people spending time on Facebook every month, right? This didn't exist. I mean, Facebook is what, 15 years old now, right? So this is an interesting problem for us where a majority of our audiences are getting used to not going somewhere. They're getting used to things coming to them or going to third-party platforms. So how do we as media companies kind of think about what is our brand, right? I mean, is India Today online, is it a brand that just gives you news and information, or is it a brand that kind of helps you with lots of other things as well, right? Or if you're, I was talking to Raj last night about Tribune, and one of the examples he gave was that how if you come to Chandigarh and if you're a visitor or you want to do something, the Tribune site should be the first site you go to because they are the best equipped to tell you all the things you can do in Chandigarh. So you're not just giving them news, but you're surrounding that information. So how do we do that, and how do we engage with like this idea that people don't come to us just for news? I think is something that most of our newsrooms are not necessarily thinking. The brand is no longer just our content. It's really the trust they have in us, right? They trust a newsroom to help them navigate this crazy world of all these numbers of exploding information. They come to us saying, help me deal with this like overflow of information, and here prioritize for me. And I think thinking about the brand more broadly rather than just here's what I produce is interesting. A lot of Indian media is particularly bad about this. Almost none of us link to anything else, right? We seem to kind of want to just keep people from only reading my story. Even if it's a report on something else, we will never give a hyperlink. But the reality is that the more you tell people, I will help you understand something, and here's the original source, oftentimes they really come back to you because you're helping them navigate it, right? So thinking very differently about what is the value I'm giving. Is it just my content, or is it some of the best newsletters that the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal produce these days, for example, are about topics where they say, here are 3 stories we wrote today on this topic, but here are 5 other stories we found about this topic elsewhere that we think you'd be interested in. And guess what? I go back to them every day because they're helping me navigate, because I don't have time to go around and find those articles elsewhere. I still go back every day to the Wall Street Journal newsletter because I know it tells me on this topic, here are 5 things I should read, 2 of them from the journal, 3 of them. So that mindset is still not here at all. Here we very consciously think that the only journalism worth reading to our readers is produced by my newsroom. Anything else is like, I won't even talk about it. But the audience is behaving very, very differently, right? So I think somehow thinking about the brand, thinking about a journalism this idea of like, we act as gatekeepers, right? I mean, most newsrooms in the US at about 10 o'clock in the morning, a bunch of people go into a newsroom and start thinking about what should I tell you tomorrow morning on the front page, right? So you are thinking about gatekeepers. But increasingly, I think we ought to think about like being gate openers, as in like, I will help you navigate this world, and that's why you come to the Wall Street Journal. You don't necessarily come only for my content. So it's a psychological kind of a mindset thing that needs to happen as well if you want to deal with this phenomena that people come less and less to us on their own. This is, again, not something very new. Most of you know this, and digital video is becoming more and more important, especially young people. But the nice thing about video is it's the first time in a long time we have a journalism format where the business model travels with the content. You know, what do I mean by that? So if I produce a video and the video runs on my site or it runs anywhere else, the pre-roll and the mid-roll and the ads that are in it, I can actually still sell them. Right? Or I can team up with somebody, I can team up with Facebook, but the revenue model sticks to the journalism. It doesn't happen with stories, right? Stories can like travel, but they travel in text and the ads don't go with them. So there's an advantage, and that's the reason why you're seeing a lot of newsrooms, particularly in the West, do a lot of video. Meanwhile, as I talked about earlier, a lot of TV money is in search of digital. What is happening is if you're the CMO of Procter & Gamble, you are very worried that you're spending a lot of money on TV. And you're saying, I need to diversify, I need to find young people, and I need to go to where they are, like the BuzzFeeds of the world, the Vices of the world. So there's a lot of money looking for good video. And I think newsrooms should think about it as both audiences want to consume video way more than some of us do of a certain age. But the business model also is kind of traveling with it. So from a business point of view, you can make money on video a lot more than any other piece of journalism that travels. The challenge, of course, is that video is expensive to produce. It requires certain skills. But increasingly, you're finding that a lot of video can be generated without having a lot of big equipment. But to think about journalism, again, most of our newsrooms are very bad about it. They think there's a video team, and then most of us do journalism, right? So somehow to think about that, our audiences actually want to consume. I mean, digital is a format where audiences not just want to read, but they want to like see pictures, they want to see, like watch video, they want to engage, they want to kind of respond, they want to put comments. So thinking about multimedia in terms of storytelling from the beginning of the story is something very critical. If you don't do this, or if you cede this to somebody else, the majority of the ad revenue that is coming into our industry is not going to be yours. It's as simple as that, right? So it's a very conscious choice that you can make. Again, not something that is particularly new in India, but in the US, for example, most brands now are finding that close to 70% of our digital audience is now consuming us on mobile, right? That number is probably going to go to 95%. It sounds great. I mean, it obviously increases our audience, and everybody has a phone, so you can reach them wherever. There's a significant downside to this just for the digital media companies as well. And you're going to see this play out in the next couple of years, where there's going to be a little bit of a bloodbath, I think, in the digital media space, which is, think of the home page or think of a page on a desktop. Chances are that it has about 3 to 4 ads on it, right? There's a banner ad, there's an ad on the side, there's usually an ad. And then think of that same page view or the same page on a mobile screen. And chances are that if you're lucky, it has a little space for an ad. Most readers think that's very annoying even if you have a big phone. So as your audiences move from desktop to mobile in a big way, your entire digital advertising model also is now getting like under significant stress as well. And so this is going to be an acute problem for all of us. Just as print was like this legacy platform that you don't know what to do with, the big looming problem for digital media companies is desktop is becoming your print, which is, it is becoming 20-30% of they consume a lot. People at desktop consume more pages than at mobile, but it's becoming a problem in the sense that, first of all, it's declining. And two, you still have to put a lot of resources into your journalism, right? Because the desktop presentation is very different from a mobile presentation. So it's exactly becoming the problem that you had with print, where I have to support all this print stuff while all my audience is digital. And now in digital, I have to still support all this desktop stuff where most of the ad revenue seems to be, but all my audience is now shifting to mobile. So it's a pretty looming problem. So if you're a newsroom thinking about the business of digital, or if you're both from a presentation point of view and from a business point of view, this problem is coming. It's going to hit everybody pretty hard if it hasn't already happened, because chances are that in India, 60-70% of your audience is also mobile now, right? So that number is going to go to 80-90%. So how you do your journalism, how you package it, but more importantly, how do you sell digital views, whether you move from selling banner ads because you can't sell more than like maybe one ad on a page on mobile instead of 3 on desktop. Maybe you move to a full page ad, like a sponsorship model. All these things have to really be thought through pretty quickly, because again, you'll find yourself in this position of saying, I have this amazing audience, 90% is mobile, and my digital money is like nothing. Right? So I think to think through this issue, both journalistically and otherwise, I think is pretty important. This is something that is starting to happen in a big way in the US, and I think there are opportunities in India as well. The idea of like content-led commerce is starting to really take root in the West in a big way. I'll give you a couple of examples. In my previous job, where I was the CEO of the Gizmodo Media Group, 25% of our revenue came from e-commerce. We would write like reviews and articles about products, and people would trust us to buy those products, and we would get like a revenue share. The New York Times spent a lot of money, I think $20 or $30 million, to buy a company called Wirecutter, where they recommend products now as part of the story. So I'll give you an example. So the New York Times will have a story that will say, a new report came out that says New York's noise levels have really gone up. And as part of the story, they would have a sidebar that says, here are 5 ways to deal with it. One is, get this get this app that is about, Zen, like, how to kind of not stress about noise. Or it will say, here are the best noise canceling headphones that you can buy. We've rated them, we've like reviewed a bunch of them, and the link is to a company called Wirecutter, and the review is from them. And then if you buy that product from Amazon or wherever you want to buy it, the New York Times actually gets like a commission on it. There are interesting issues around disclosure, around transparency about this. But the reality is, remember, what is our brand has evolved from it being only content to it being about trust, right? People come to the New York Times because they trust the New York Times. You could argue a lot of people don't come because they don't trust it. That's a different problem. But those who come trust the New York Times. So they're saying if the New York Times, in a review of products, is saying this is the best headphone, I'll buy it, right? And so as a result, the commerce as an idea, content-led commerce, is becoming pretty big. And you have some interesting opportunities here as well. As you know, Walmart bought Flipkart. Walmart's biggest problem is Amazon. So between the two of them, they're going to have interesting rivalry. There's an opportunity to, if you are a media company, to kind of team up with one of them and say, what if we do product reviews and people come to your site to buy it, and then because we are sending a lot of traffic, we can get like a percentage of the thing back. It's pretty standard in the US. So Amazon links to you, and for 24 hours, if you go from the New York Times or any of these companies that are participating and buy something, automatically Amazon will give you, depending on the product, like X% of that. So it's an interesting trend. It's starting to happen in a big way, and you will see this continue as well. I'm getting the time signal, so I'll just run through this pretty quickly as well. Again, a very, very philosophical point I want to make. A lot of us have thought of our journalism and our newsrooms as, if I'm Times of India, my competition is Hindustan Times. If I'm the Wall Street Journal, my competition is the Financial Times. The reality of that has changed pretty significantly. This was true when people were living in a city and the only choices they had was one of these two papers. But in the digital world, we are all very, very promiscuous. We can pretty much go anywhere we want by clicking our, keyboard, our mouse, by increasingly talking to our devices. If you want to really read a story about something that's happening in Washington, you can all go to the Washington Post, right? You don't have to read it in the Times of India. So as a result, our competition is not like any other product. It is really the one single non-renewable resource, and I'll repeat that. The one single non-renewable resource your readers have, which is their time. Because they can go anywhere, and if you can get 10 more minutes of their time with you, how do you make money and all you can figure out, as long as you get them to spend time with you. So thinking in terms of like, how do I think of my competition, how do I kind of engage my audiences that they're spending more time with me than anybody else, is a very interesting way of thinking about how do you present journalism, how do you package it. The extreme example is obviously clickbait, right? Where you can force them to come to you and realize that you defrauded them, if you will. But a positive example is I make something so engaging that the next time something happens, they are like, my last experience with, Times of India or Mint or any of this for that particular event was really good. Let me go to them and see how they have done this, right? So I think trying to think of it as, I want to get their mind share, get 10 more minutes of their time, because once you have them, how you monetize that is a different ballgame. This is, again, very, very kind of a little bit of a forward-looking thing. We spend a lot of time thinking about where do we invest, where are some of the bets we want to make. And oftentimes we wait, right? Whether is it Android going to do well, or iPhone, or is it Siri, or is it Alexa? And then we wait for something to become really big and then say, okay, how do we engage with them? But one of the ways I think media companies should be thinking about is to kind of step back and say, what are some of the big trends we are seeing? And one of the big trends that you're probably going to see is this idea that we will all be entering into more of a hands-free world because we can talk to our devices. So I'll give you an example of driverless cars, right? You could all sit here and say, oh my God, in Delhi roads, I can't imagine driverless cars ever really succeeding, right? So let's assume that only 1% of all the cars in the world will be driverless. That's a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands all of a sudden that you could potentially think about monetizing. I'll give you an example again. A lot of people drive from New Jersey and Connecticut into New York every day, right? It's a 1-hour drive each way. Traffic is pretty bad. They're obsessively focused on the traffic. They don't have time for anything else. If even 5% of them end up in driverless cars, you have 100,000 people who suddenly have an hour on each commute where they could be doing something with that time, whether they're watching a movie because they don't have to worry about driving, they're listening to something, so the car is reading them news, right? So if you think about, if you believe that hands-free is going to be a big part of the future, the time to think about how does journalism fit into it, what am I doing to kind of be part of a conversation with a Tesla or any of these guys saying, how do I become part of your dashboard? I think those are the conversations we should be having. Otherwise, what will happen is the Spotifys and the Netflix and all these guys will be in there and will be saying, we missed that opportunity, and they will be scrambling to kind of create that opportunity. So I think as newsroom leaders and newsroom managers, I think it's important to think about where are things going and can my journalism fit into that, and what do I do about it, and do I need to have early conversations about that as well? So just something to think about. I'm going to stop here. I have a couple of more slides, but I think I've said enough, and we'll be happy to take any questions. How much time do we have, by the way, total? 10 minutes? Excellent. Okay, so questions. Let's start here and then go there and then there.
Two very quick ones. Primarily in India, we are seeing also in Asia, a lot of companies are going, to your point, to exclusive events, created either curated events created for their readers, or also outsiders where you can pay and get in. And Economist does it, FT does it, CEO roundtables, and and increasingly here, interestingly, Times of India has about 100 IPs through now their response, which ranges from cookery shows to news shows to a whole bunch of stuff, which is pretty interesting. People don't know about it, but they're putting a lot of money in it. So do you think that events, this curated content, is going to be a big trend going forward? Is it going to be sustainable? Because your resources to create them are limited. And the second one is that, the product placement thing, I mean, doesn't it create a problem with ethics? Because, that boundary is pretty thin. I mean, what is plug-in and what is placement?
Yeah, so just as we think of like paywalls as like a source of revenue, but not the answer, events is a good source of revenue because if you do an event well, we're talking about like a 40-50% margin, right? I mean, you make a lot of money on an event if you do it well and if it sells out, and there's sponsorship and there's tickets as well. But events are deceptively non-scalable businesses, simply because, first of all, you're battling the calendar. There are only so many days in a year, working days, and there are like so many events happening. So you, just to find a day when nothing else is happening is automatically a limiting factor. right? So there's that. And two, every event that you do is actually very, very bespoke, right? Meaning that I gave this example yesterday. So Media Rumble could say, this event is doing very well. Let me take it to Bombay. Let me take it to Bangalore. Let me take it to Calcutta, right? Fair enough. But the actual event, the template might work, but they have to actually put the whole event together separately every single time, right? So that's the part where it's not as scalable as you think, but you could, if it fits in with your brand and if you could do half a dozen events and they're done very well, it can offer a nice stream of revenue. The problem with events we run into is when we get too greedy. When we're like, we do 5 and say, oh, we should do 50. And then everything falls apart pretty quickly, the quality and all of that. So I think that's the way to think about events, as yet another source of revenue. Oftentimes it creates a lot of content for your journalism. And again, goes back to my larger point of thinking about what is my brand. Oftentimes your brand is also your ability to curate interesting people, right? Because you're the Economic Times, you can actually get a bunch of CEOs wanting to come. So that's the power of the brand. So you can leverage that, right? No harm in doing that. So I think thinking about it those ways, not straying too far from it, I think is, I ended up buying a company in India called VC Circle for News Corp because they were pretty good at some particular kind of events. It's not very scalable, but it's an interesting business as well. To your other point about the thin wall, the problem is never with the actual source of revenue. The problem is always with how your newsroom behaves, right? Meaning if your leadership of your organization is kind of setting clear rules and being very transparent and doing all of that, then I don't see necessarily an issue. For example, again, Gizmodo Media Group, at the top of the page, we say, at the top, not even at the bottom, saying if you happen to buy something based on these recommendations, we get revenue from it, right? So you're very, very clear about it. The other way to get around the e-commerce part, and this is how the New York Times and big companies do, is not to have a relationship with the product companies at all. So I'll give you an example. So we write a story that says, you want to buy a home exercise machine for 5,000 rupees, right? So the article will go something like, first of all, you're an idiot because for 5,000 rupees, they're all very bad, right? And then say, if that's the only money you have, we've looked at 3 of these, out of which this one was horrible, these 2 were okay, so if you want to buy it, feel free to buy it. I have no relationship with the product companies because we'll provide links to all 3, the good one and the bad one, and I only get money from Amazon if you actually do a purchase, right? So my ability to say something about the product company is pretty intact, right? I agree, it requires a particular discipline, it requires not kind of having very clear ground rules, but I don't think any of us will stand here and say the New York Times is ethically challenged, right? So if they can pull it off, I think the rest of us on the less ethically challenged thing can pull it off too.
Hi, sir. I just had a comment on the paywall thing.
Could you tell me who you are, sir?
I'm Vivek. You talked about Indians not wanting to pay for...
I don't believe it, but I hear that.
I just want to take that point forward. Most of the content that is on offer in India's mainstream media is not worth paying for. So that is a question that, media owners and journalists need to ask themselves. The second point is, some of the guys who have tried, paywall journalism, the journalism is pretty good. But the stories that they write probably impact or, interest 150 people in Whitefield in Bangalore. Okay. So, I can't name the organization, but, so.
Sounds like the Ken.
Okay. So given this, so these are the issues. The other thing that I wanted you to ask is, have you heard of the browser? There's a website called thebrowser.org. It essentially curates interesting content from a lot of websites which are behind paywall. So like the New York Review of Books or, the New York Times, Bloomberg. So do you see that model working? Because, I'm ready to pay. I pay for the Business Standard every month, which is behind the paywall. But what irritates me is I can't remember 10 different logins, 15 different passwords, and when to pay. And, it's basically a problem. So is there a space for an aggregator in the business?
Yeah, so 2 questions here, right? One is the idea of like, you can only successfully pull off a subscription or even a membership, really, you have to think in terms of what is the value exchange, right? Otherwise, nobody will pay. What is the value you're giving them, and what is the value they're giving you back? So I think it's a good way to think about it. Look, the reason we went from subscription to membership at the Wall Street Journal was we were hearing exactly the same thing, which is like people were saying, 85% of what I read at the Wall Street Journal, I get free from Business Insider, right? So should I really pay $250 for the few things that you do well? Which is a standard problem with any newsroom that is doing general interest, right? Because most of what you do is not proprietary. But constructing a paywall requires you to think what pieces of what I'm doing is really good and proprietary, and can I continue to sustain that, and is that enough? Oftentimes the answer is not really, right? Business Standard is a good example where I think a certain number of people think their opinion pages are very good, right? Certain number of people think their policy and analysis is very good. Nobody thinks they're better than Economic Times for breaking news, right? Because nobody, right? So, but you're still willing to pay for that. So I think the way to think about it is like, that's why I think in India particularly, my larger point is first of all, because of this psychological issue of most Indians won't pay, you're already way behind in thinking about it. And I'm saying don't automatically just follow the subscription route. Maybe just like you skipped landlines and went to mobile, maybe leapfrog and say, let's think about memberships. Then, sticking with the Business Standard example, if you say, look, once every 3 months, we will have a Slack channel or we'll have a conversation with Nainan, right, as part of being part of the member. That'll be pretty attractive, even though he's getting up in his age. I can say this, he was my first boss. So I think there are ways to construct it. Look, in the US, this trend is becoming pretty good, where niche subject matter sites are starting to do fairly well as long as you're not ambitious, right? There's a site called Chalkbeat which writes about education. There's a site called ProPublica, you all know. So there's a whole bunch of them. India, that's just starting to happen, right? The Ken is a good example of that. People seem to be wanting to pay. Would the Ken think of itself as being a mass media of 500,000 subscribers? Seema is here somewhere. She probably doesn't think that way, right? So I think within their ambition, they probably will do fine, actually. And if I were Ken, I would think of like actually doing events because they have the curation power and all of that, right? So I think that's the way to think about it as well. So, and then the second part of your question, I agree with you. I think it's happening in the US particularly, where people are starting to add up all the things they have to pay for, because now you have to pay for everything, right? Magazines and all of that. So you will probably see finally an industry that doesn't like to cooperate starting to do it for simple economics reasons. So there's a Dutch company called Blendel, which is trying to kind of create a la carte model where you pay X amount and you consume whatever you want to consume. At the back end, they pay. There's a company called Scroll, not the Indian one. There's a company which has actually signed up a whole bunch of media companies where for like a $6 subscription, you can read any of them. And at the back end, they will pay back those companies. So you will start seeing some of the traditional kind of a telco or cable TV model. Yeah, I mean, iTunes has the advantage of, because iTunes' success really depended on singles, right? You can't really, I'm not sure that singles in journalism is going to work, meaning that pay me for this article might work, but the friction is pretty high and all of that. At the back end, that's why I think a subscription or being a member of Scroll and saying, I'll pay $6 and I can read however much I want might be a better approach. And there's a lot of hype about Bitcoin, but underneath that, the blockchain model actually, where everything can be like very easily kind of attributable, you will see a lot of efforts in media on blockchain as kind of saying, is there a way to create a payment system that is so easy that you don't worry about what you're reading at the back end, somebody is allocating it back.
Hi, this is Anup. You spoke about the desktop becoming the new print and now mobile becoming the new desktop. But there is also a lot of challenges with the form factor, and which is where the trick lies, if you can crack that. There is also a lot of conversation now about getting hooked onto it, and therefore there's a lot of research about how do people get off it. What is it that is happening out there that tells us that this is the way forward, and what are the challenges in this space? Is it really going to be in that sort of form, or is the the questions about it being sort of a dopamine kind of a thing.
Yeah, I'm not overly worried about people getting hooked on devices to consume more content, because it's not a bad problem to have, right? If you're a parent and you want to deal with your kids, that's a different issue. But collectively, I think, look, I mean, the way to think about this is very simple, which is that you pick a brand, any news brand, and it's never had more audiences now than it had, than ever in the history, right? So I think that's a general good phenomena that people can read more of you and more people are reading that. The point I was trying to make was, I think the point you were trying to make, Anup is a designer, so he's thinking about it from a UX. You have to spend a lot of energy creating a package of stories for desktop that is actually very different if you put it on mobile. And that's what I meant by saying you have to give a lot of resources to both of these, and the resources have to shift into mobile while your revenue is not following. Exactly what happened with print and digital. I think that's where you have to make some choices about, you have to be mobile first increasingly, right? Just as for a while we were trying to be digital first, right? And that has interesting kind of consequences. Just getting a reporter to write a lead where the first paragraph actually fits in the screen of a mobile rather than keep going on and on. I think that's a creative challenge that you have to kind of educate the newsrooms about. I'm less worried about the addiction aspect of technology. I think I'm sure when radio came, a lot of people were like, oh my God, we're going to be spending all our time with listening to things. When TV came, I'm sure we had the same fear. So I'm not overly worried about that it's sometimes a societal issue, but it's a good problem for the media world.
How does the newsrooms handle this change where you're looking at print, primarily print newsrooms?
I'll give you a quick example and kind of back off and say we haven't handled it well, right? If we did, we wouldn't have all these big industry problems in the first place. But what a lot of big media companies are doing is they've flipped the model now. So there's now inside a newsroom a print desk. Remember, 5 years ago there was a digital desk and everything else was print. They've now appended it and said, here are 10 people who will come in at 3 o'clock and only spend their time about the print platform next morning. But there are only going to be 10 of you. Right? The rest of the newsroom is going to operate like we're 24/7. So that's starting to happen where the resources being given to print are both dedicated and shrinking, which is the opposite of how it was before. This is where I don't quite understand, including your own newsroom, where India seems to be someplace going the opposite, where they're splitting digital and print in 2018. It's the most insane idea I've ever heard, because who has the resources to duplicate this, right? Everybody's going one way and here for commercial reasons, because you want to put all sorts of other things on the web your newsroom doesn't like. You're splitting them up, which is the most ridiculous, half-assed way of thinking about this.
Thank you so much, Raju.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we please give him a huge round of applause?